This next lecture is on integrated pest management. So this is another PowerPoint produced by Dr. Frankie Lamb, and integrated pest management is very important regarding the concepts of entomology and insect control. And since Dr. Lamb is an entomologist, his focus is all about insects, which I'm not going to fault him for it, but IPM includes the controls for bacteria and for fungi and for any other potential problem with a pathogen that you could consider a pest in agriculture or any other environment. So from an agricultural standpoint, we do have concerns with bacteria and fungi and insects and viruses and nematodes and certain other types of organisms. And they all use the same principles of control. Now, in agriculture, we generally divide things up into two camps. There's the conventional agriculture, and there's the organic agriculture. And on the conventional agriculture side, we have pretty much an open book of opportunities on all of the things we can use as fertilizers, as pesticides, as any other inputs for conducting our agricultural operations. If it's legal and we follow the instructions and we follow safety guidelines, we make the choices and we keep the entire legal book open as a conventional grower. As an organic grower, there's a myth. The myth is that organic growers don't use chemicals. Organic growers definitely don't use pesticides, and that's not true. Agricultural operations always use chemicals and pesticides and other inputs. And the only major difference is that your list for an organic grower is a shorter list. The idea is for an organic grower, you can only use naturally occurring materials as inputs in your field unless they are prohibited. So there are some naturally occurring things like arsenic, you can't use that, or lead, you can't use that. You can't use fossil fuels, that's naturally occurring. You cannot use fossil fuels directly as an input for your agriculture. You can use it in your tractor to burn diesel, but you can't refine it, turn it into something and put it on your field as a pesticide, for example. The closest you get there is burning diesel. You can use the flame from burning diesel to control weeds. Flaming weeds is perfectly legal. But there are lots of other, quote, natural compounds that do qualify, and they are chemicals and they are pesticides that you can use. On the other side, there are synthetic or man-made materials or natural materials that have been largely purified. And you can't use those in organic unless they're allowed. And there are some exceptions where synthetic materials are allowed. And those exceptions, there are a number of them. I'm not going to go through. This isn't a talk about organic versus conventional. But in general, on average, the inputs used by organic farming practices tend to be safer for the environment, safer for the workers, less toxic to the workers. I'm not a big believer in the argument that they're safer for the consumer. There's very little to no evidence that the products of conventional farming are any less safe than the organic products once they reach the grocery store. It's all about workers. And in some cases, you could argue that there is evidence in several important cases where organics are actually less safe for consumers. And I don't want to get into that. I'm pro-organic to an extent, but it has to be based on science and truth and not some emotional attachment to conventional bad, organic good. That's not really true. And as far as the environment is concerned, yeah, on average, organic farming tends to be better for the environment, but there are some really unfortunate examples where it's not. Things like the use of sulfur. The number one user of sulfur in agriculture by a long shot is the organic farming community in terms of per acre use of sulfur. Sulfur acidifies the environment. Sulfur is not necessarily dangerous to use, but you're burning more diesel to apply it because you have to apply it by hundreds of pounds and you have to apply it all the time. And where did it come from? Very toxic strip mines. And those very toxic strip mines where the sulfur is coming from, the organic community kind of covers its eyes. I don't see that. That's not good for the environment. That's horrible. I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist. And there are other situations. The worst fertilizer on earth, in my opinion, is fish emulsion. It's a great fertilizer from a science standpoint. It's a horrible fertilizer from an environmental standpoint because they use these special nets that strip mine anything swimming in the ocean. And if it gets in the net, it becomes fish emulsion. It is not a waste product from fish industries. It is strip mining the ocean. And fish emulsion, what's its really only customer? Organic farmers. And it is doing horrible, horrible damage to our environment. Is that the only two extremes? Is there only conventional and organic? And the answer is no. From a legal standpoint, yes, those are the only two that have legal definitions. Conventional is anything that's legal and used properly. You have the entire playbook open to you. Organic, you have a legally defined subset of those chemicals and inputs and fertilizers that you're allowed to use based on the National Organic Program's list. And in between those extremes is something called Integrated Pest Management, IPM. Know it as an acronym, IPM, Integrated Pest Management. And the idea of IPM is really important. But let's back up a little bit before I get to that. The concept of pesticide use and what we call the insecticide era began quite a long time ago. And so initially there were some highly, highly, highly toxic things that people used that killed people and rats and insects. They killed everything. And we learned about poisonous substances in the environment like arsenic, and we did use those in the early days to great extent with some mixed results and some problems, people dying, poisoning the environment, all kinds of other problems. But it wasn't until around World War II, 1939, that there were insecticidal properties of this chemical diphenyl trichloroethane. A real mouthful, so we just call it DDT. And the beauty of DDT from a chemist's standpoint is it kills a very broad range of insects. And it's relatively non-toxic to humans. And so I've got pictures from the World War II era of soldiers and people in indigenous peoples of different regions like North Africa in their underwear, walking underneath this guy standing on a ladder, taking a sack of DDT powder and pouring it over the people, covering them in DDT powder. and it would kill the lice and other things, fleas, lice, would kill mosquitoes, and it saved a lot of lives from diseases spread by biting, sucking insects, malaria from mosquitoes. Many thousands of people have been saved by DDT because it was not directly or obviously toxic to humans in super high concentrations or over time. It is a neurotoxin and it can have some impacts, but it's generally not considered that big of a deal for humans in modest or low numbers of exposures. So along comes DDT. Everybody thinks it's wonderful and it's easy to manufacture, and so it's being sprayed and spread all over the earth after World War II. And it didn't take long because it wasn't just DDT. The love of chemicals and chemistry and science exploded coming out of World War II. And so we started to put complete faith and complete trust and just absolute adoration for industry and chemistry and how we were able to gain control of many things in medicine, in agriculture, in industrial processes. It was the next wave of the industrial era, and through chemistry. And so people blindly started using things, and the assumption, and I still remember it as a kid, the assumption was you can't possibly create enough chemicals to hurt the earth. The earth is too big. And there was a saying, the solution to pollution is dilution. Just dilute it. Anything that's poisonous, if you dilute it, becomes non-poisonous, right? Well, that's mostly true, not always. That is mostly true. The problem is, how much can you dilute it? Well, just throw it in the ocean, throw it in the rivers. It'll dilute in the environment. Nature will take care of it. It will dilute. And the idea at the time seemed logical because the tiny specks of humans couldn't possibly have a huge and lasting impact on something the size of the Earth. And in the 1950s, we were starting to recognize that's not really too smart. We continued with that kind of head in the sand behavior and attitude through the 50s and even largely through much of the 60s. And people started to wake up. People started to say, this is a problem. And so Rachel Carson, a famous writer, an environmental writer, wrote a book called Silent Spring in 1962, 58 years ago. And Silent Spring was a name, a title for the book in reference to the death of songbirds. Songbirds were dying, and science was linking the death of these songbirds to high DDT levels in the bird's fatty tissues, causing a thinning of the eggshell. And so when the mother bird would sit on the eggs would crack. Cracked eggs don't turn into baby chicks, crashing the songbird population, hence Silent Spring. And it was the perfect time. It was the launching period of the environmental movement. It came out at the perfect time when the 1950s awareness, the people's beginning to distrust the fact that chemicals are all safe and dilution is the solution. And so when the book came out in 1962, the public was largely ready to hear it, at least enough of the public, not everybody. And Rachel Carson was not totally anti-DDT. She recognized its benefits, but she also recognized that we have to be more aware of what we're doing. And so there was a groundswell. Over the rest of the 1960s, there was this groundswell of momentum that exploded with the Vietnam era. And so the hippie generation put a lot of pressure on society in general and our government representatives to say, we got to do something. And it was so bad at times that you could actually light rivers on fire. There were so many toxic chemicals in some rivers in the industrial parts of the northeastern industrial complex of the United States that the waste chemicals were being dumped out through pipes into the rivers. And you could light a match and the river would catch on fire. There was one river fire that was so bad it destroyed a whole bunch of wooden bridges along this river. The whole river caught on fire. It was massive. That's a pretty easy thing to get through people's minds, that there's a problem. And so a lot of other things happened. President Nixon at the time, a Republican president, was actually the one who signed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and created the Environmental Protection Agency. So a lot of people say, you know, environmental concerns is all about Democrats and the Republicans are all about business, but it's not that cut and dry, and it changes through the era, through the different generations. And some of the most important environmental laws that we have as a foundation on the books, the things that were created between 69 and 73 roughly, largely responsible for at least signing them, maybe not drafting them. The president usually doesn't draft legislation, he signs it, but he signed it. And so that period, not only are we learning about chemistry, but we're developing new chemistries. And so this is a whole period of a love affair with chemistry and understanding of the pesticidal effects, trying to find new things. How do we use it? Very, very interesting period in our historical growth of chemical use. Now, where did this DDT originally come from? It was actually synthesized in Germany way back in 1873. And I can't recall the original properties they were looking for, but it's been known about for a very, very, very long time. But because of the knowledge that we learned about DDT, because of the spotlight that Rachel Carson put on it in her book, and then the 10 years later, having a foundation of environmental laws, DDT has been completely banned in the United States. It's still available in certain parts of the world, but in the United States and a lot of countries, it's banned because not only is it toxic to birds, toxic to just about every insect, it kills everything, and that's not a good approach. But it stays in the environment. It's very stable and it's very persistent. You could go out and sample the muds of the Salinas River, dig a trench down and sample it, and you could find DDT there today. It normally doesn't last that long, but I mean, it lasts a long time. It doesn't last decades and decades in large quantities, but traces of it still are hanging out. And we haven't used it in the Salinas Valley for many decades. During World War II, the DDT was used, as I mentioned, for control of mosquitoes, fleas, and lice. Louse is the singular, so he's using the singular here. Just mosquitoes, fleas, and lice would be the plural. And thousands of lives saved. Actually, Mueller, because of this development in 1939, he received the Nobel Prize in 1948. Nobel Prize winner. And a lot of people now look back and go, he's evil. He did all of this harm to the environment. Everything is a double-edged sword. So here's Rachel Carson uh, died shortly after the publication of her book, but at least she was around long enough to see some of the successes that came out of it. She wasn't able to see the result of what happened at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, but she made a big difference. And she's largely heralded as somebody who really launched the environmental movement of the 1960s. And I think that's a little bit rewriting of history. She was at the right place at the right time and said the right thing. I don't think she went out there as an activist, but she became a spokesperson. And I think to a certain extent, it is legitimate to say she was a leader of the environmental movement. And her book, coming at the right time, gave a flag of truth, a flag of information to the environmental movement. And I'm not going to read this. You can pause if you want to read a quote out of the book. So that was kind of the beginning of what we would call the modern pesticide era. And since then, we've changed a lot, we've learned a lot, and we have lots more chemicals, a lot more targeted chemicals and other ways of dealing with pests. So first of all, what is a pest? A pest is a species that interferes with human activities. So it's subjective. If we don't like it, we call it a pest. It interferes with our activities, our property, our health, or is in some way objectionable. So if we made mud houses, termites we wouldn't consider a pest, but we make wooden houses. And so we consider termites to be a pest. Mosquitoes spread disease. I think that's a very easy thing to call a pest because many millions of people die because of mosquitoes. The cabbage moth eats my cabbage and makes it unmarketable, so I can't sell it. Again, interfering with my activities. So along comes integrated pest management. You know, this is something that actually has been around for a very long time. Actually, the concept of integrated pest management came around at a similar time to the idea of organics. But it is a comprehensive pest technology that uses combined means to reduce the status of pests to tolerable levels while maintaining a quality environment. So the idea, integrated pest management, means you're integrating or combining different strategies to control pests to a tolerable level, not kill everything. And if you go back to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and even largely in the 70s and part of the 80s, there was an attitude, if it moves, kill it, in agriculture. And there's still some people who have that attitude, but not too much. Kill everything. DDT is wonderful. We don't want insects. Insects, even the good ones, might spread bacteria on their feet or something. You know, anything that's in our fields is bad. And we now know that's not the case. We know it very, very strongly. We need communities of organisms in our natural environment. We need a living community in our soil. We need a living community of arthropods, insects, earthworms, and other things living in our environment, because when you have a healthy community, the good guys, the bad guys, they keep each other in check. And so things don't get out of hand, usually. But that's difficult. There's not a perfect answer. But the philosophy is you're trying to develop a community, some philosophy that is completely compatible and consistent with most of the attitudes and goals of organic farming. Integrated pest management and organics share a lot of their basic philosophy. Have a healthy environment. The only problem with integrated pest management is there's no legal definition of it. There's no rules to it. There's just philosophies on how to approach problem solving in agriculture, especially with respect to pests. And pests does not mean just the insect pest. It's the bacteria, fungi, viruses, everything. And so you're using multiple tactics. You're using cultural practices, you're using some chemicals, you're using fertilization, genetics, you're using every tool in your toolbox that you can. You certainly are trying to keep pest populations down below economic levels, but you're not worried about killing everything. You're not worried about having some pests, even if they're the bad guys. You just don't want them to get out of hand, causing you serious economic damage. That's the idea. And you're trying to conserve a healthy environment. So for the tactics of integrated pest management, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to be right back.